The child's feet make no sound on the carpet of pine needles, each step careful, deliberate, as twilight bleeds through the canopy of the ancient Slavic forest. The air tastes of copper and earth, that particular heaviness that comes when day surrenders to something older than night. Then the child hears it, a sound that doesn't belong to any living thing. The slow, methodical grinding of bone against earth, rhythmic as a heartbeat, patient as death itself. For over 1,000 years, that sound has echoed through the consciousness of Eastern Europe. The grinding, scraping approach of something that walks on chicken legs, that dwells in a house built from the bones of the forgotten. Baba Yaga. You know the name. You think you know the story. An old witch in fairy tales, a bedtime story to frighten children into obedience. But what if everything you were told was a careful mistranslation, a deliberate softening of something far more terrible? This is not a documentary about folklore. This is an investigation into 7 secrets that suggest Baba Yaga never existed, only in stories. We will uncover ancient rituals performed in forest clearings where the soil still refuses to nourish life. We will examine real disappearances, documented cases spanning centuries, all sharing impossible similarities. We will descend into archaeological discoveries that official reports have tried to bury, findings that challenge everything we understand about pre-Christian Europe. And we will listen to modern encounters, testimonies from people who have no reason to lie and every reason to remain silent. By the time we reach our conclusion, you will understand why generations of Slavic people still fear to speak her name after dark. You will know why mothers pull their children inside when the forest goes quiet. You will learn what the tales were really trying to tell us. Not fantasies meant to entertain, but warnings meant to keep us alive. The grinding grows closer in the darkness. Something is walking through the trees, and it remembers when we used to listen. Deep in the pine forests of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist clings to ancient valleys like cobwebs to forgotten corners, archaeologist Dmitry Volkov made a discovery that would transform our understanding of Eastern Europe's most haunting fairy tale. It was the spring of 2007, and his team had been excavating a pre-Christian settlement site near the Ukrainian village of Kolomaya when they uncovered something that shouldn't exist. Not a burial mound, not a settlement foundation, but something stranger. Small wooden structures, elevated on what appeared to be deliberately carved posts, arranged in a semicircle at the very edge of where the forest began. These were not homes for the living. The structures measured barely 6 feet in length, far too small for human habitation. Yet each contained human remains, carefully positioned, sometimes with personal belongings, sometimes with objects whose purpose remained mysterious. Carved wooden birds, small clay figurines, bundles of herbs that had long since turned to dust, but left telltale residue in the soil. The carbon dating results came back with remarkable consistency. Between 800 and 1200 years old, placing them firmly in the pre-Christian Slavic period, that shadowy time before churches and crosses reshaped the spiritual landscape of Eastern Europe. What Volkov had found were death houses, structures designed specifically to hold the bodies of the dead, elevated above the ground on wooden posts that, over the centuries of examination, have revealed themselves across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. These were not isolated anomalies, but part of a widespread burial practice that modern archaeology has only begun to fully document. In the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, researchers have cataloged over 300 documented sites where such structures existed, some preserved only as post holes in the earth. Others, in the permafrost regions of Siberia, remarkably intact, their wooden walls still bearing the marks of the axes that shaped them. Professor Elena Mikhailova, a folklorist at Moscow State University, who has spent 30 years studying Slavic burial customs, describes what these structures would have looked like in their original context. The death house, she explains, was typically built after a death occurred, constructed specifically for that individual. The body would be placed inside, sometimes sitting upright, sometimes lying down, depending on regional customs. Then the entire structure would be elevated on posts or stumps, raising it anywhere from 3 to 6 feet off the ground. The reason for this elevation appears in the old beliefs like a recurring nightmare. The dead needed to be separated from the living earth. They existed in a liminal space, no longer part of the world of the living but not yet fully departed to whatever realm awaited them. In the museum archives in Kiev, there are drawings made by early ethnographers in the 1800s, sketches of the last surviving examples of these structures before modernization swept them away. What strikes you immediately is how the wooden posts supporting these small houses were often carved, shaped, given deliberate form. Sometimes they resembled tree trunks with the branches cut away. Sometimes they were more elaborate, carved into representations that scholars have interpreted as birds, animals, or abstract designs whose meanings have been lost to time. And sometimes in illustrations that send a chill through anyone familiar with Russian folklore. The posts number exactly 2, and they're positioned at what would be the front of the structure, like legs. The death houses were never meant to be permanent. This is crucial to understanding what happened next, how reality transformed into legend. The structures were built of wood, erected quickly, often by family members in a state of grief and ritual observance. Over months and years, the Carpathian weather would begin its work. Rain would soak the wood. Frost would crack it. The posts would begin to rot from the bottom up, where they met the earth. Wind would push against the elevated structure, creating stress on posts that grew weaker with each passing season. Archaeologist Volkov describes what his team observed at excavation sites where multiple death houses had been erected over generations. The wooden posts don't rot evenly. Depending on the type of wood used, the direction of prevailing winds, the specific soil composition, and drainage patterns, one post might deteriorate faster than another. What happens then is something that eyewitnesses in the 1900s actually documented before the last of these structures disappeared. The death house begins to tilt. As one post weakens and compresses, the structure shifts its weight. From a distance, especially in fog or twilight or through the trees, it would appear that the small house had moved, that it had turned, that it had, in the most literal and unsettling sense, walked. In the archives of the Russian Geographical Society, there's a photograph from 1923, taken in a remote village in the Urals. It shows one of the last traditional death houses still standing. The image is grainy, black and white, but what it captures is extraordinary. The small wooden structure tilts at a severe angle, its supporting posts clearly rotted and uneven. One seems thicker than the other, and there's an unmistakable suggestion of legs in their positioning. The house appears caught in mid-step, frozen in the act of turning. The villagers who still remembered the old ways told the photographer that the structure had been there for over 50 years, and that it had slowly rotated over the decades, turning with the seasons like a sundial marking not hours, but the passage of death itself. But the death houses were more than just burial structures. Their location matters enormously. Volkov's team noticed that every single death house they excavated was positioned at a boundary, the edge of the village and the forest, the border between cultivated fields and wild meadow, the line where the river met the shore. This was no accident. In pre-Christian Slavic belief, boundaries were places of power and danger, the threshold between two states, two worlds, and the dead, existing in their own threshold state between life and whatever came after, belonged in these boundary places. This is where archaeology meets folklore in a way that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Because in the oral traditions collected across Slavic regions, there exists a figure who dwells at exactly these boundaries. An old woman, powerful, dangerous, possessing knowledge that the living should not have, living in a house that stands on legs, a house that can turn, that can move, that exists between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Baba Yaga. The witch, the crone, the wise woman, the death goddess in disguise. Professor Valentina Prop, a second-generation folklorist following in the footsteps of her famous grandfather Vladimir Prop, has studied the Baba Yaga tales with particular attention to the descriptions of her dwelling. In over 200 variants of the tale collected from different regions, certain details repeat with remarkable consistency. The hut stands on chicken legs. It spins. It can turn its back to the forest and its front to the visitor, or vice versa. It's always at the edge of the forest, never deep within, never in a village. The hut itself serves as a gateway. Those who enter must undergo a transformation. They cannot return as they were. The chicken legs, Prop argues, are a later interpretation, a rationalization by storytellers who no longer remembered the death houses. The original posts would have been carved from wood, worn by weather, resembling the thin, knobby legs of birds more than human supports. In some of the oldest variants of the tale, the hut doesn't stand on chicken legs but on goose legs or crane legs or simply bird legs. Birds, in Slavic mythology, were psychopomps, creatures that could cross between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Birds that stood at the water's edge, at the boundary between land and water, just as the death houses stood at the boundary between village and wilderness. At the archaeological site near Kolomea, Volkov's team found evidence of something else that connects directly to the Baba Yaga legends. Around several of the death houses, they discovered the remains of fences. Not ordinary fences, but structures made of posts topped with what analysis suggested were skulls. Animal skulls in most cases, though in 2 instances, the remains suggested human skulls. In the fairy tales, Baba Yaga's hut is surrounded by a fence of bones, topped with skulls whose eyes light up at night. The shamanic connection cannot be ignored. In traditional Slavic society, certain women held roles as healers, midwives, herbalists, and death attendants. They lived often at the edges of villages, possessing knowledge that made them both essential and feared. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They attended births and prepared bodies for burial. They existed at the threshold of life and death in a professional capacity. When someone died, these women would be called upon. They would prepare the body. They would, in some regions, oversee the construction of the death house. They would perform the rituals that helped the deceased transition from one state to another. Over time, as Christianity spread and old practices were suppressed, these women became more threatening to the new religious order. The helpful village wise woman transformed in the cultural memory into the dangerous witch. But the tales remembered her original function. Baba Yaga, in the stories, is indeed dangerous. But she's not simply evil. Those who come to her with respect, who understand the proper rituals, who can answer her questions and withstand her tests, receive her help. She gives magical objects. She provides knowledge. She helps the hero or heroine complete their transformation. She serves in narrative terms exactly the function that the death house served in reality. A threshold, a place of transformation, a passage from one state of being to another. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate. In 2014, a team working in the Białowieża forest on the border between Poland and Belarus uncovered a site with 7 death houses arranged in a deliberate pattern. All faced the same direction initially, but the shifting of their posts over centuries had rotated them at different angles, creating an eerie effect, as if they had gathered in conversation. Local legends in the nearby villages spoke of a place in the forest where the dead walked, where small houses moved in the night. The site had been avoided for generations. What we're seeing in the Baba Yaga tales is folk memory operating exactly as anthropologists have long theorized. Real practices, real structures, real customs being transformed through generations of retelling into narrative, into symbol, into the witch in the walking house. The death houses rotted away centuries ago, but the image they created burned itself into cultural consciousness so deeply that it survived in story form. A house on legs that can turn and move. An old woman who lives at the boundary between worlds. A place of testing and transformation where death and life meet and exchange secrets. The hut on chicken legs is real. It was always real. Built by grieving hands to hold beloved dead, elevated above the earth on posts that time would transform into legs, positioned at the edge of everything known. And in those dark forests of Eastern Europe, where the boundary between world and wilderness grows thin, perhaps some part of them still walks. In the late spring of 1967, a team of Soviet foresters working deep in the woods outside Kostroma found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had been marking trees for a planned logging operation, moving through a particularly dense section of old-growth forest that locals rarely entered, when one of them noticed something unusual about the clearing ahead. The trees seemed to stop at an unnaturally precise line, as if nature itself had been instructed to keep its distance from whatever lay beyond. What they discovered when they stepped into that clearing would trigger one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the region's history. an inquiry that would ultimately raise more questions than it answered and expose a shadow world of belief and practice that supposedly had no place in the modern Soviet state. The clearing itself was perhaps 20 meters across, ringed by ancient birch and pine trees whose branches seemed to lean away from the center as if repelled by some invisible force. But it was the fence that stopped the foresters cold. Constructed from weathered wooden posts driven deep into the earth, it surrounded the entire perimeter of the clearing, and every single post was crowned with a skull. Animal skulls of every description: deer, wolves, foxes, badgers, birds both large and small. Some were bleached white by years of exposure to the elements, while others retained fragments of dried tissue and matted fur. The eye sockets stared outward in all directions, a warning, or perhaps an invitation, depending on one's perspective. Between the posts, stretched like macabre garlands, were bones of all sizes, strung together with what appeared to be sinew and wire. They had been arranged in patterns, deliberate and geometric, configurations that suggested meaning, even if that meaning remained opaque to the men who stared at them. Some bones formed star-like shapes, others spirals, still others symbols that resembled letters from no alphabet the foresters recognized. The senior foreman, a practical man named Viktor Sokolov, who had spent 30 years working in these woods, later told investigators that his first instinct was to turn around and leave. There was something about the place, he said, that made the hair on his arms stand up, something that triggered a response older than reason or ideology. But duty prevailed over instinct, and the team moved closer to examine what lay within the fence. At the center of the clearing stood a small wooden structure, barely large enough to be called a hut. It was built in an old style, logs chinked with moss and mud, a roof of layered bark held down with stones. No windows broke its walls, only a low doorway covered with a hide that might have been deerskin. Around this dwelling, the ground had been deliberately cleared and marked with circles of white stones. Within these circles lay offerings of various kinds: wooden bowls, clay vessels, bundles of dried herbs, and objects less easily identified. Sokolov made the decision to contact the authorities before investigating further. Within hours, police from Kostroma arrived, along with officers from the regional security apparatus. What had begun as a routine forestry operation had become something far more complex, touching as it did on matters of unauthorized religious practice and potential criminal activity in an officially atheist state. The initial police investigation focused on determining whether the site represented an active threat or merely an abandoned relic of superstitious past. Officers carefully documented everything they found, photographing the skull fence from every angle, cataloging the arrangements of bones, examining the contents of the hut. Inside that cramped dwelling, they discovered a world frozen in time. A sleeping pallet of furs and dried grasses. A cold fire pit ringed with stones. Shelves holding jars of preserved foods, dried mushrooms, roots, and substances the investigators could not immediately identify. Most disturbing were the books, handwritten ledgers filled with notations in old Russian script mixed with symbols and diagrams that suggested magical or ritual purposes. But it was during the forensic examination that the investigation took its darkest turn. The skulls and bones that decorated the fence were sent to experts for analysis, and what they discovered changed everything. While most of the skeletal remains were indeed animal in origin, some were unmistakably human. Fragmentary but identifiable, finger bones, teeth, portions of skull. The forensic pathologists determined through early radiocarbon dating techniques available at the time that these human remains spanned an enormous time period. Some were relatively recent, perhaps decades old, while others dated back centuries, to a time long before the Soviet Union, before even the Russian Empire in its modern form. This finding suggested something that deeply unsettled the investigators. The site had been in use for generations, possibly for hundreds of years, maintained and utilized by a succession of individuals who knew its location and purpose. This was not the work of a single disturbed individual, but rather evidence of a tradition, passed down through time, surviving every social upheaval and ideological shift that had swept across Russia. The authorities turned their attention to the surrounding villages, communities of a few dozen families each, scattered through the forest. The questioning began with simple inquiries. Did anyone know about the clearing? Had anyone seen smoke or other signs of habitation in that part of the woods? The response was uniform and absolute. A wall of silence met the investigators at every door. People claimed ignorance, shook their heads, offered nothing. But their eyes told a different story. There was recognition there, and fear, and something else that the more perceptive officers identified as protectiveness. It took days of persistent questioning before cracks began to appear in this united front. An elderly man, after his third interview, let slip a reference to the old woman of the woods. A mother, concerned about her children being questioned, mentioned that people sometimes went to her for help with ailments that doctors could not cure. Gradually, fragmentarily, a picture began to emerge of a woman who had lived in that clearing for as long as anyone could remember, a practitioner of what locals carefully called the old ways. She had no name that anyone would share, or perhaps she was known by many names. Different villagers called her different things: babushka, znakarka, vedonia, datita. Grandmother, wise woman, knowing one. People spoke of her in whispers, with a mixture of reverence and fear that transcended Soviet education and official atheism. They described a woman of indeterminate age, always old, perhaps always the same age, who knew the properties of every plant in the forest, who could read signs in the flight of birds and the patterns of frost on windows. According to these reluctant testimonies, villagers had been coming to her for generations, seeking remedies for illness, solutions to problems both practical and spiritual. They brought her offerings in exchange for her help: bread, milk, eggs, coins. They left these gifts at designated spots around the clearing, never approaching the hut itself unless specifically summoned. Some claimed they had never actually seen her face to face, only heard her voice calling instructions from within her dwelling, or found the items they needed placed where she had indicated. The investigators pressed for more information about the nature of her practices, about what exactly occurred at this site. But here, the wall of silence reasserted itself with even greater force. People became evasive, claimed not to know details, insisted they had only heard rumors. What was clear was that the villagers believed she possessed knowledge and power that they both needed and feared, that she represented a continuity with a past that official history had declared dead and buried. Most chilling for the investigators was the discovery that fresh offerings were still present at the site when it was first found by the foresters. Bread that had not yet molded, milk that had only recently soured, coins so new they gleamed. Someone, or perhaps many people, had been visiting the clearing regularly, maintaining a relationship with the old woman, right up until the moment of discovery. This meant she had been there recently, might have been there when the foresters arrived, might have slipped away into the forest while they stood frozen at the edge of her clearing. A search was organized, teams of police and volunteers combing the woods for any sign of the woman or indication of where she might have gone. They found nothing. No tracks, no abandoned campsites, no body. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the forest that had sheltered her. Some of the searchers, speaking privately, admitted that they were not entirely disappointed by this failure. There was something about the whole situation that made even hardened officers uneasy, a sense that they were interfering with forces better left undisturbed. The investigation gradually wound down, frustrated by lack of evidence and the uncooperative attitude of the local population. The site was documented and officially sealed, though how one seals a clearing in the middle of a vast forest remained an open question. The human remains were taken for further study, the ritual objects catalogued and stored. Official reports were filed that carefully navigated between acknowledging the disturbing facts and avoiding any suggestion that there might be legitimacy to folk practices and superstitious beliefs. But the mystery remained, unyielding and profound. Who was the old woman of Kostroma? Where had she gone? Most unsettling of all, who would take her place? The investigators never discovered whether the tradition died with her disappearance or whether someone else, trained in the old ways, stepped forward to maintain the site and serve those who still believe. The villagers certainly never said, their protective silence extending forward into the future as firmly as it had covered the past. To this day, the case file remains open but dormant, a collection of photographs and testimonies that raise questions about the persistence of ancient practices in the modern world. The skull fence of Kostroma stands as a reminder that beneath the surface of official reality, older currents continue to flow, beliefs and traditions that survive in the shadows, waiting for those who still know where to look and what to ask. The old woman vanished, but what she represented, the knowledge she carried, and the needs she fulfilled, those proved far harder to erase than any government could have anticipated. The boundary between the village and the forest was never a place of safety. In the settlements that stretched across medieval Rus, from the muddy streets of Novgorod to the scattered hamlets of the Dnieper basin, these liminal spaces held a particular terror and a desperate hope. Here, where the last wooden fence posts gave way to wild grasses and the dark line of trees began, lived the women who could save your child or curse your family forever. They were called wise women, grandmothers, healers. They lived in hovels that seemed to lean away from the village proper, structures built on foundations that locals swore moved with the seasons. These women knew which mushrooms could end a fever, and which could end a life. They caught babies in their gnarled hands, and whispered prayers that the Orthodox priests claimed came from older, darker sources. When winter famine struck and children wailed with empty bellies, when plague turned skin black and breath foul, mothers walked that terrible boundary path in the hours before dawn, seeking help they could not find within the sanctified walls of their village. The church saw these women differently. In the ecclesiastical courts of 16th and 17th century Russia, records accumulated like kindling for pyres that would eventually burn. These documents, preserved in monastery archives and church libraries, tell a story that mingles genuine persecution with genuine terror, where the line between healer and monster dissolved in the smoke of suspicion. Consider the trial records from 1578 in the merchant city of Novgorod. The case involved a woman known to her community as Baba Vasa, though the church scribes recorded her given name as Vasilisa Mikhailovna. She was accused of crimes that would echo through folklore for centuries to come. The charges were specific and horrifying. She stood accused of enticing children to her dwelling, a structure the witnesses described with remarkable consistency. A hut built upon supports that resembled the legs of enormous chickens, allowing it to rotate away from unwanted visitors, or turn its doorless wall to those the occupant did not wish to see. The trial documents describe how she decorated her fence posts with skulls, though whether these were human remains or animal bones cleaned and arranged became a point of bitter dispute. Neighbors testified that they had seen children approach her home and never return whole, that boys and girls who sought her remedies or followed her promises of sweet things came back changed, hollowed out, their youth somehow diminished. One witness claimed that Baba Vasa consumed the essence of children to extend her own unnatural life, that she had lived on that boundary for longer than any person could remember, unchanging while generations aged and died around her. The chicken-legged hut detail arrests our modern attention because we know it from fairy tales, from the cottage of Baba Yaga that stands on birds' feet and spins to face the hero who speaks the proper incantation. But here in the court records of Novgorod, half a century before the earliest written collections of Baba Yaga stories, we find actual accusations against an actual woman describing this exact architectural impossibility. The rational explanation suggests a practical origin. Some scholars propose that Vasa's home was built on tree stumps, roots exposed and gnarled into shapes that frightened minds could read as talons. Others suggest a dwelling built on a kind of turntable foundation, able to be rotated away from harsh winter winds, a clever adaptation that superstitious neighbors transformed into evidence of witchcraft. But the documents reveal something more disturbing than architectural misunderstanding. They show a pattern of accusation that tracks precisely with disasters. When the winter of 1576 brought famine to the Novgorod region, when stored grain rotted with ergot fungus and children began dying in numbers that overwhelmed the parish death registers, the accusations against Vasa intensified. Mothers, who had once crept to her door for fertility herbs or remedies for childhood fevers, now testified against her. The same women who had paid her in eggs and cloth for midwifery services now swore she had cursed their pregnancies or stolen their infant's breath in the night. The trial record includes testimony from a woman named Marfa, who claimed that Baba Vasa had helped birth her daughter 3 years earlier, but that the child had never thrived, remaining small and sickly while Vasa herself seemed to grow stronger. Marfa testified that she had seen Vasa in the forest, gathering herbs by moonlight, speaking to the shadows in a language that predated the Slavic tongues. Another witness, a widower named Pyotr, swore that his son had vanished after visiting Vasa's hut seeking a cure for winter cough, and that he had found the boy 3 days later, alive but silent, unwilling or unable to speak of what had occurred within those chicken-legged walls. The pattern repeated across medieval Russia and Eastern Europe. Church records from Pskov in 1593 described the trial of a healer named Mokosh, a name that itself recalled pre-Christian goddess worship. She lived, the documents specify, at the edge of the settlement where cultivated fields surrendered to marshland. She was accused of requiring strange payments for her services, not silver or goods, but riddles answered, tasks completed, symbolic exchanges that the church identified as demonic pacts. Children who sought her help were required to circle her dwelling 3 times while calling out their request. Those who failed to complete the ritual properly, it was said, found the door would not appear no matter how they searched the hut's perimeter. These trial records reveal the economic and social vulnerability that made certain women targets. Baba Vasa was a widow without sons, surviving on the edges of a community that had no formal place for unattached elderly women. Mokosh had been accused of adultery decades before her witchcraft trial, a social stain that never faded. These were women who lived beyond patriarchal protection, who possessed knowledge that seemed dangerous precisely because it was not controlled by male religious or civic authority. The midwifery connection was particularly damning. Birth was a threshold moment, a passage between life and death, where the midwife held terrible power. She was the first to touch the newborn, the first to whisper over its wet head, the first to declare it viable or doomed. In an era when nearly half of all children died before reaching 5 years of age, when mothers regularly perished in childbirth, the woman who presided over this bloody threshold accumulated both gratitude and suspicion. When things went well, she was honored. When they went terribly wrong, she became the obvious scapegoat. The church records show how infant mortality statistics correlated with witch accusations. In years following plague outbreaks or famines, when parish registers showed spikes in child deaths, trials of elderly midwives and healers increased proportionally. The winter of 1633 saw catastrophic crop failures across central Russia. The following spring and summer brought a wave of trials against wise women. In Vladimir, 3 elderly healers were executed. In Tver, 2 more. In each case, the accusations involved the theft of children's vitality, the consumption of youth, the transformation of innocent babies into hollow vessels. These women were accused of needing child flesh or child essence to maintain their powers. They were said to lure hungry children with promises of bread and honey, only to drain them of life force, leaving behind animated corpses or changelings. The specific details of Baba Yaga folklore appear again and again in these trial records, not as references to a known tale, but as supposedly witnessed facts. The mortar and pestle she flies in appears as a real implement used for grinding human bone. The broom she uses to sweep away her tracks becomes evidence of attempts to hide visits to Christian cemeteries, where she dug up unbaptized infants. The fence of bones transforms into documented accusations of macabre decoration. What we witness in these records is the creation of a monster from the flesh and blood of vulnerable women. The Baba Yaga of folklore, with her iron teeth and appetite for children, her impossible hut and her ambiguous gifts, emerged from the actual persecution of actual women who lived on actual boundaries. The tales preserve the fear and the scapegoating, transforming complex social dynamics into simple moral lessons about the dangers that lurk at the edges of civilization. These wise women occupied a space that medieval society found intolerable, a position of power without official sanction. They held knowledge of herbs that could end pregnancies or ease difficult births, information that challenged church authority over life and death. They practiced folk remedies that blended Christian prayer with older incantations, syncretism that church officials identified as heresy. They lived independently, survived without husbands, and accumulated small forms of wealth through their services, all of which marked them as unnatural in a strictly patriarchal social order. The records show how communities turned on these women during crisis periods, transforming gratitude into accusation, respect into terror. The same knowledge that made them valuable made them vulnerable. Understanding which plants could save a life meant understanding which could end one. Knowing prayers to ease childbirth meant potentially knowing curses to prevent it. In the desperate logic of communities facing inexplicable tragedy, these women became the explanation for suffering that otherwise had no clear cause or cure. The winter of 1989 brought more than political upheaval to Eastern Europe. In the remote Polish village of Piotrowież, nestled among the agricultural flatlands of the Lublin voivodeship, something inexplicable began to manifest in the night sky. What started as whispered rumors among field workers soon became a documented phenomenon that would challenge the rational minds of everyone who investigated it. The first sighting occurred on the night of November 7th, when Zofia Kowalska, a 53-year-old primary school teacher, was returning home from an evening faculty meeting. She had taught mathematics and science for nearly 3 decades, a woman known throughout the community for her practical nature and skeptical mind. She was driving along the narrow country road that bordered the communal wheat fields when her car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, twice, then extinguished completely, leaving her in darkness. What happened next would change her life forever. As Zofia sat in her disabled vehicle, reaching for the flashlight she kept in the glove compartment, she noticed an unusual glow rising from beyond the tree line to the east. At first, she assumed it was a farmer burning crop stubble, though the lateness of the hour and the season made this unlikely. The light grew brighter, more intense, and then it began to move. It lifted above the skeletal branches of the birch trees, and that's when she saw it clearly. Suspended in the air, perhaps 50 meters above the frozen field, was what appeared to be a large vessel, cylindrical in shape and emanating a pale, greenish-yellow luminescence. Inside or atop this craft, Zofia could make out the unmistakable silhouette of a hunched figure, cloaked and hood-covered, wielding what looked like a massive pestle. The figure appeared to be grinding or churning the air itself, and the vessel was moving deliberately across the sky, traveling from east to west at what Zofia later estimated to be the speed of a bicycle. She watched, paralyzed with equal parts terror and fascination, for what she calculated to be approximately 4 to 5 minutes before the apparition descended behind a distant copse of pine trees and vanished. Her car started immediately after the light disappeared. Zofia drove straight to the local police station, where her report was filed with visible skepticism by the night duty officer. She insisted on a formal written statement, which she signed and dated. That document still exists in the provincial archives. Zofia Kowalska might have been dismissed as a woman suffering from stress or an overactive imagination, except for what happened 6 nights later. Jerzy Nowak, a 47-year-old postal worker, with no connection to Zofia beyond sharing the same village, was making his usual evening walk with his German shepherd when the dog suddenly became agitated. The animal pulled violently at its leash, whining and attempting to drag Jerzy back toward their home. Jerzy had served in the military and had never seen his usually obedient dog behave this way. Then he heard it. A strange grinding sound, rhythmic and mechanical yet somehow organic, coming from above and behind him. He turned and witnessed nearly the identical phenomenon that Zofia had described. A luminous, barrel-shaped object moving through the night sky, and within it or upon it, the distinct form of what he could only describe as an old woman, bent over something that resembled an enormous mortar and pestle. The figure appeared to be propelling herself through the air by pounding or grinding with deliberate, forceful movements. Jerzy noted additional details. He saw what looked like fabric, perhaps a shawl or cloak, billowing behind the figure. He described her face as deeply lined and shadowed, though the distance and the eerie light made precise features impossible to discern. The dog went silent, lying flat on the ground, trembling. Jerzy stood transfixed as the vessel passed overhead, close enough that he felt a tingling sensation on his skin, a static charge that made the hair on his arms stand upright. The air smelled unusual, he would later report, like ozone mixed with something herbal and acrid, reminiscent of burning sage or wormwood. The entire sighting lasted perhaps 3 minutes before the craft descended rapidly into the northern fields and disappeared. Jerzy immediately reported his experience to the authorities, and when police compared his account with Zofia's earlier statement, the similarities were undeniable. Both witnesses independently described the cylindrical vessel, the grinding motion, the elderly female figure, the peculiar greenish light, and the direction of travel. Neither witness knew about the other's report when they gave their testimonies. The third witness was perhaps the most credible of all. Dr. Helena Wisniewski was a 61-year-old physician who had practiced medicine in Piotrowicz for nearly 40 years. She was a woman of science, trained in Warsaw, respected throughout the region. On the night of November 24th, she was returning from a house call to a patient in a neighboring hamlet when her motorcycle's electrical system failed completely. Unlike Sophia, Helena was familiar with mechanical issues and immediately recognized that this was no ordinary malfunction. Her headlight died mid-beam, and even her battery-powered wristwatch stopped functioning. She pulled to the side of the road and was about to examine her vehicle when she noticed the now familiar glow emerging from the southern fields. What she witnessed aligned perfectly with the previous accounts, but Dr. Wisniewski provided additional clinical observations. She noted that the light had a frequency that seemed to pulse, approximately 1 cycle per second. She observed that the figure appeared to be using the pestle as a form of propulsion, each downward thrust corresponding with a surge in luminosity. She estimated the vessel's dimensions at approximately 2 meters in length and perhaps 60 centimeters in diameter. Most significantly, Dr. Wisniewski approached the phenomenon with scientific curiosity rather than fear. She attempted to get closer, leaving her motorcycle and walking into the field. As she approached to within perhaps 70 or 80 meters, she felt an overwhelming sensation of dread that she described as entirely unlike any psychological state she had experienced in her medical career. It was, she stated in her report, as if her body was responding to a threat that her conscious mind could not fully process. She also noted experiencing vertigo and mild nausea. The vessel continued its westward trajectory and descended into the forest beyond the village outskirts. By late November of 1989, Piotrowicz had become the subject of investigation by multiple parties. Local journalists arrived first, followed by researchers from the University of Lublin, and eventually, representatives from various governmental agencies, though the precise nature of their interest remained officially classified. What these investigators discovered would only deepen the mystery. At 3 separate locations corresponding roughly to where witnesses reported the craft descending, investigators found unusual ground markings. These were not the elaborate geometric patterns associated with crop circles, but rather circular burn marks, each approximately 3 meters in diameter. The soil within these circles had been subjected to intense heat. Laboratory analysis revealed that the ground had been heated to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, enough to partially vitrify the silica in the soil. The burn patterns were roughly circular but irregular, with the most intense heating at the center. Botanical examination of the affected areas revealed that vegetation within the circles had not merely been burned, but desiccated at the cellular level, as if all moisture had been instantly extracted. More puzzling still, the burn marks showed no evidence of any accelerant or chemical residue that might indicate a hoax using conventional means. The most extraordinary physical evidence emerged in early December, when a farmer named Marek Zielinski was plowing one of the affected fields in preparation for winter. His plow struck something solid approximately half a meter beneath the surface, near the center of one of the circular burn marks. Excavation revealed an ancient stone mortar, carved from a single piece of granite, measuring nearly 70 centimeters in height and weighing an estimated 45 kilograms. The mortar was covered in symbols that initial analysis suggested were Proto-Slavic in origin, possibly dating back more than 1,000 years. Local archaeologists from Lublin examined the artifact and confirmed its probable antiquity, though they could not explain how it came to be buried in that precise location. Soil analysis suggested it had been interred there for at least several decades, possibly much longer. The farmer insisted that this field had been in his family's cultivation for 3 generations, and no one had ever mentioned finding such an object before. The mortar was removed to a regional museum, where it remains in storage to this day. Perhaps the most scientifically intriguing evidence came from electromagnetic readings taken by researchers who set up monitoring equipment in the fields following the sightings. Between December 2nd and December 15th, instruments recorded multiple instances of significant electromagnetic anomalies, particularly during the hours between 9 in the evening and midnight. These readings showed sudden, dramatic fluctuations in the local magnetic field, sometimes reaching intensities 5 to 10 times higher than baseline measurements. The anomalies lasted between 2 and 7 minutes and occurred without any corresponding visual phenomena, at least none that human observers detected. One researcher, a physicist named Andrzej Kamiński, noted that the electromagnetic signatures bore some resemblance to those associated with ball lightning, a rare atmospheric electrical phenomenon that was poorly understood even by late 20th century science. This observation would become central to the rationalist explanations that began to emerge. Skeptics and scientific investigators proposed several conventional explanations for the Piotrowicz sightings. The ball lightning hypothesis suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions, possibly related to the unseasonably cold weather and low cloud cover that characterized that November, had created rare electrical phenomena that witnesses misinterpreted. Ball lightning can indeed produce luminous effects, electromagnetic disturbances, and even ground burns. However, ball lightning does not typically persist for several minutes, travel in controlled straight-line paths, or produce humanoid silhouettes within its glow. The shared hysteria theory proposed that once the first report became public knowledge, suggestion and expectation caused other witnesses to interpret ordinary phenomena like distant car headlights, agricultural machinery, or even celestial objects through the lens of the initial fantastical claim. This explanation struggled to account for the independent nature of the early testimonies and the specific technical details that aligned across witness accounts. The hoax hypothesis suggested an elaborate prank, perhaps involving some kind of illuminated drone or tethered balloon designed to resemble the legendary Baba Yaga. However, investigators found no evidence of any mechanism, no witnesses who saw preparations or aftermath, and no credible motive for such an elaborate deception in a small agricultural community. Moreover, the technology required to create such an effect in 1989, particularly something capable of producing the documented electromagnetic effects and ground burns, would have been extraordinarily sophisticated. The legend of Baba Yaga, the fearsome Slavic witch who travels in a flying mortar and pestle, is ancient and widespread throughout Eastern European folklore. She is a liminal figure, neither purely evil nor entirely benevolent, dwelling at the boundaries between the civilized world and the wild forest. She is associated with death, transformation, and forbidden knowledge. For the witnesses of Piotrowicz to independently describe imagery so precisely aligned with this centuries-old archetype raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between folklore and observed reality. The final piece of this unsettling puzzle emerged in early January of 1990. A woodcutter discovered the body of an elderly woman in a remote section of the forest, approximately 3 kilometers from the village. The body was identified as Agnieszka Kowalczyk, a reclusive woman in her late 70s who had lived alone in a small cottage deep in the woods. Local residents knew of her but had little contact with her. Some referred to her as a healer, others as eccentric or touched. The circumstances of her death were never fully determined. She had clearly been dead for several weeks, likely since late December. The condition of her cottage provided the most disturbing details. Inside, investigators found extensive collections of dried herbs hanging from the rafter. Roots, fungi, and plants, some common, some rare, some difficult to identify, were stored in clay vessels throughout the single room. Most remarkably, they found what appeared to be ritual implements: carved wooden staffs, stones inscribed with symbols similar to those on the ancient mortar, and bundles of what forensic analysis identified as human hair and bird bone. The body itself was found in a small clearing, approximately 100 meters from the cottage. She lay on her back, arms crossed over her chest, surrounded by a circle of river stones. At the 4 cardinal points around her body were clay bowls containing the remnants of burned herbs. The scene had the unmistakable appearance of a deliberate ritual arrangement, though whether self-performed in anticipation of death or created by an unknown party afterward could not be determined. Local authorities conducted a perfunctory investigation and recorded the death as natural causes, likely hypothermia or heart failure. The cottage and its contents were eventually cleared, and the property absorbed back into the collective forest lands. No family came forward to claim the body or her possessions. She was buried in the village cemetery with minimal ceremony. The connection between Agnieszka Kowalczyk and the aerial phenomenon was never officially established. Yet the timeline remains stubbornly suggestive. The sightings occurred in late November. The last confirmed sighting was on the 24th. Based on decomposition analysis, Agnieszka likely died in the final days of December or the very first days of January. Had she been alive during the sightings? If so, had she witnessed them herself from her forest dwelling? Or was there some deeper, more disturbing connection that rationalist frameworks could not accommodate? In the years since 1989, Piotrowicz has returned to its quiet agricultural routine. The witnesses remain adamant about what they saw. Zofia Kowalska, now retired from teaching, still keeps the copy of her police statement in a frame on her wall. Dr. Wisniewski, before her death in 2007, gave several interviews in which she maintained that she witnessed something that defied conventional explanation. Jerzy Nowak refuses to discuss the incident publicly, though neighbors report that he never again walked his evening route after that night. The stone mortar remains in museum storage, catalogued and largely forgotten. The electromagnetic anomalies ceased after mid-December of 1989 and have never recurred. The burn marks in the fields eventually weathered and were plowed under, leaving no visible trace. The case of Piotrowicz exists in the uncomfortable space between explanation and mystery, where credible witnesses, physical evidence, and rational skepticism collide without resolution. It reminds us that the world may harbor phenomena that resist our categories, events that echo ancient stories we thought were merely metaphors for primitive fears. Whether the witnesses saw an atmospheric anomaly, experienced a collective psychological episode, or encountered something genuinely anomalous, the fact remains that multiple credible people reported seeing an old woman flying through the night sky in a vessel resembling a mortar. And an old woman who fit that description died alone in the forest that same winter, surrounded by the implements of practices far older than modern. The ambiguity itself is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of those strange weeks in 1989, when the boundary between folklore and reality seemed to dissolve over the frozen fields of a small Polish village, leaving us to wonder what else might be waiting at the edges of our understanding. In the darkness of a museum storage room in St. Petersburg, a human skull rests in a glass case, its jaw frozen in an eternal grimace. But what draws the eye, what makes the breath catch in the throat, is not the age of the bone or the empty sockets where eyes once gazed upon the world. It is the teeth. Each incisor, each canine, has been deliberately filed down and capped with bronze that still gleams after more than 2,000 years. This is not the skull of a monster from folklore. This is the skull of a woman who once rode across the steppes of Eurasia, a warrior whose very smile was a weapon of psychological warfare. The iron teeth of Baba Yaga have haunted Slavic folklore for centuries. In every telling, in every whispered warning to children who stray too far into the forest, those teeth remain constant. Not simply sharp teeth, not fangs like an animal, but teeth of iron, teeth of metal, teeth that speak of something unnatural and profoundly wrong. Scholars have long dismissed this detail as mere embellishment, the kind of grotesque exaggeration that folklore accumulates over generations. But the archaeological record tells a different story, one far more disturbing precisely because it is true. Between 1947 and 1993, Soviet and later Russian archaeologists excavated more than 300 burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe, from the Black Sea to the borders of Mongolia. These kurgans, as they are called, contained the remains of the Scythian and Sarmatian peoples, nomadic warrior cultures that dominated these vast grasslands from roughly the 8th century BCE to the 4th century CE. Among the thousands of burials, a pattern emerged that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient gender roles and the origins of certain persistent folkloric images. Approximately 1 in 4 graves containing weapons also contained the skeleton of a woman. These were not ceremonial burials or symbolic placements. The bone analysis revealed combat injuries, healed fractures consistent with sword fighting and horseback archery, muscle attachment points that spoke of lives spent wielding weapons and controlling horses at full gallop. But it was the teeth that told the most unsettling story. In burial mound number 47 near Pokrovka in southern Russia, excavators found the skeleton of a woman in her 30s, buried with a bronze mirror, an iron sword, and over 200 bronze arrowheads. When the physical anthropologist cleaned the skull for analysis, she discovered that every front tooth had been deliberately filed into points and capped with thin sheets of bronze. The modification had been done while the woman was alive, the bones showing clear signs of healing and adaptation to the metal coverings. Similar findings emerged from sites across Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and southern Russia. At least 68 female skeletons from Sarmatian burials showed evidence of deliberate dental modification, with metals ranging from bronze to iron actually worked into the teeth themselves. The process would have been excruciating. Based on experimental archaeology and analysis of the bone trauma, researchers determined that the teeth were first filed down using abrasive stones. Then the exposed surfaces were fitted with thin caps of metal, possibly hammered in place while hot and allowed to cool, fusing with the tooth structure through a combination of technique and the body's own healing response. The women who underwent this modification would have endured weeks of pain, infection risk, and the constant metallic taste in their mouths. And they did it voluntarily, repeatedly, as a mark of status and identity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described his encounters with the Scythians and made particular note of their women, whom he claimed fought alongside men and were distinguished by their fierce appearance and custom of marking themselves in ways that inspired terror in their enemies. Later classical sources mention Sarmatian women warriors with gleaming teeth that caught the light like blades. For centuries, scholars dismissed these accounts as the exaggerations of Greek writers describing distant barbarian. The archaeological evidence proves they were describing exactly what they saw. But why teeth? Why choose such a painful, dangerous modification when other forms of body decoration were available? The answer lies in the psychology of warfare in the ancient world, particularly mounted warfare on the open steppe. Combat was close, personal, and psychological. A warrior who could project inhuman ferocity had an advantage before the first arrow was fired or the first sword drawn. And nothing is quite so unsettling as a human face made subtly wrong, a smile that flashes with metal teeth that suggests something predatory and other. Contemporary accounts from other cultures provide context. The Maori warriors of New Zealand practiced tomoko, extensive facial tattooing designed to make their war faces terrifying to enemies. The berserkers of Norse tradition worked themselves into states of apparent madness before battle, convincing opponents they faced something more than human. The Scythian and Sarmatian warrior women, with their metal teeth, were engaging in the same psychological warfare, transforming their own bodies into weapons that worked on the mind as much as the flesh. Genetic studies conducted between 2012 and 2019 have revealed the extent to which these steppe peoples contributed to modern Slavic populations. DNA analysis shows significant genetic markers from Scythian and Sarmatian populations in modern Russians, Ukrainians, and other Slavic groups. Evidence of centuries of intermingling as the nomadic peoples gradually settled or were absorbed into agricultural societies. The migration patterns traced through both genetics and linguistics show waves of movement from the steppes into what would become Slavic territories, particularly during the 4th through 7th century CE, precisely the period when the earliest forms of Slavic folklore were taking shape. The memory of the steppe warriors did not die with their cultures. It transformed, as historical memory always does, into story and symbol. The fierce warrior women with their metal teeth became something else in the folk imagination, separated from their human context, and remade into figures of supernatural dread. The iron teeth remained, but the woman who chose to modify herself for warfare became a cannibal witch lurking in the forest, her martial ferocity reinterpreted as predatory hunger. Museum collections across Russia and Ukraine contain dozens of these skulls, though few are on public display. The visceral impact is too strong, too disturbing for general audiences. To see the actual remains, to look at the metal still attached to ancient bone, is to confront the reality that the most nightmarish details of folklore sometimes have their roots in historical truth. In the State Hermitage Museum, a single case in the back rooms contains 3 skulls from Sarmatian burials near the Don River. All 3 are women. All 3 have bronze caps on their front teeth. The metal has corroded to green and black, but it still holds firm after more than 2,000 years. The connection between these archaeological finds and Baba Yaga becomes even more explicit when we examine the other attributes of the folklore figure. Baba Yaga is not simply a witch. She is a figure who exists on boundaries, who moves between worlds, who possesses knowledge and power that ordinary people lack. The Scythian and Sarmatian warrior women occupied exactly such liminal spaces in their own cultures. They were women who took on male roles, warriors in societies where warfare defined status and power. They were buried with honors typically reserved for men, yet their graves also contained distinctly feminine items. They existed between categories, and humans have always found such boundary-crossing figures both fascinating and frightening. The chicken-legged hut in which Baba Yaga dwells has parallels in Scythian mortuary practices. The kurgans themselves were often surrounded by wooden structures raised on posts, creating elevated platforms where rituals were performed. To approach such a site would have been to encounter a dwelling that seemed to stand above the earth, separated from the normal world. The connection is not direct, but it shows how elements of material culture can be absorbed into folklore and transformed. What archaeologists have found in the burial mounds goes beyond individual graves. They have uncovered evidence of communities where women warriors were not anomalies, but integrated members of society. At the Pokrovka Cemetery complex, analysis of over 100 burials revealed that women with weapons graves, including those with dental modifications, were buried among the general population, suggesting they were not outcasts or exceptions, but recognized members of their communities. This challenges the narrative that transforms them into isolated, threatening figures. The real women were part of a social fabric. The folklore witch is alone, separated, dangerous precisely because she exists outside community bonds. The transformation of historical memory into folklore follows predictable patterns. As the steppe cultures faded, as their ways became incomprehensible to the agricultural Slavic peoples who inherited their territories, the images remained but the context vanished. A woman warrior with metal teeth, once understood as a defender and a figure of status, became inexplicable. The human imagination, faced with inexplicable images passed down through generations, fills in the gaps with fear. The metal teeth remain, but their purpose shifts from intimidation of enemies to the consumption of human flesh. The warrior becomes a cannibal. The defender becomes a threat. This process reveals something profound about how folklore functions as cultural memory. It preserves images, sometimes with startling accuracy, while completely transforming their meaning. The iron teeth of Baba Yaga are not an invented detail or a random embellishment. They are a memory, distorted by time, but rooted in the reality of women who lived and fought and modified their own bodies in ways that echo across millennia. When we tell stories of Baba Yaga to children, we are, in some strange sense, keeping alive the memory of those Sarmatian warriors, even as we have forgotten who they truly were. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, and each new finding reinforces the connection between the folklore and the historical reality it has absorbed and transformed beyond recognition. In the spring of 2003, 3 university students from Yekaterinburg embarked on what they believed would be the adventure of their academic careers. Dmitry Volkov, Anna Chernysheva, and Mikhail Sokolov were not ordinary hikers seeking recreational thrills in the Ural Mountain. They were folklore enthusiasts, amateur researchers obsessed with Slavic mythology, and they had spent nearly 2 years planning an expedition to find something most people considered purely fictional. The hut of Baba Yaga, the legendary witch who dwelled deep in the Russian forests, her home perched on chicken legs, spinning in endless circles among the ancient trees. The trio had pooled their resources, studied old maps, interviewed elderly villagers in remote settlements, and compiled what they called their research archive, a collection of stories, coordinates, and historical accounts that they believed would lead them to an area of the Urals where the boundary between folklore and reality had allegedly grown thin. Friends and professors dismissed their quest as romantic nonsense, but the 3 remained undeterred. On April 12, 2003, they departed from the small village of Severny Pokrov with provisions for 3 weeks, camping equipment, several cameras, and journals to document what they anticipated would be groundbreaking discoveries in the field of comparative mythology. The first entries in their recovered journals reveal excited, almost euphoric observations. Anna's handwriting was meticulous as she described the pristine beauty of the forest, the way morning mist clung to valleys like ghostly hands, the profound silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of their footsteps. Dmitri documented geographical markers and sketched crude maps showing their progress deeper into territory that local guides had quietly advised them to avoid. Mikhail, the most romantic of the three, wrote poetry about walking in the footsteps of ancient stories, about feeling the weight of centuries pressing down through the canopy of birch and pine. By day 5, the tone began to shift. Anna noted that they had found a series of carved symbols on tree trunks, symbols that matched illustrations from 18th century folklore collections they had studied. She photographed these markings extensively, her entries growing more technical, more focused, as if trying to convince herself through documentation alone. The symbols were old, she insisted, weathered but deliberate, arranged in patterns that suggested intentionality rather than random vandalism. Dmitri became preoccupied with directional anomalies. His compass behaved erratically in certain clearings, and he wrote lengthy paragraphs attempting to rationalize these inconsistencies through geological explanations, magnetic deposits, natural phenomena that refused to quite fit his theories. It was on day 8 that they mentioned her for the first time. Mikhail's entry, dated April 20th, described seeing an elderly woman gathering herbs near a stream. He had called out to her, thinking perhaps she was from one of the isolated homesteads that still existed in these remote regions. But she had simply looked at him with eyes he described as impossibly dark, then turned and walked into the forest with a speed that seemed wrong for someone of her apparent age. He convinced himself he had misjudged the distance, that the fading light had played tricks on his perception. But the next day, all three saw her. Anna's journal entry from April 21st is detailed and unsettling. They had made camp in a small clearing when they noticed smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the forest. Investigating, they found the old woman sitting beside a fire, stirring something in an iron pot. Anna described her appearance with almost clinical precision. A face carved with deep wrinkles, hair the color of winter clouds, hands gnarled like tree roots, but eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that made Anna profoundly uncomfortable. The woman wore layers of what looked like handmade clothing, fabrics dyed in shades of deep red and black. When Dmitri asked if she lived nearby, the woman smiled, revealing teeth that Anna swore were too white, too perfect for someone of such apparent age. The old woman spoke in a dialect they struggled to understand, something archaic, but they caught words about the forest, about travelers, about things that watch and wait. They should have left then. Later analysis of the journal suggests all three knew something was deeply wrong, but their obsession had become a kind of madness. Instead of retreating, they followed when the old woman gestured for them to come deeper into the woods. Dmitri's entries from April 22nd describe walking for what felt like hours, but covered surprisingly little distance according to his GPS device, which he noted was also malfunctioning. The forest seemed to shift around them, paths that should have been straight curved back on themselves, and always ahead, the old woman moved with that same unsettling speed, never quite running but somehow staying ahead of them no matter how fast they walked. They found the structure on April 23rd. Mikhail's photographs, later recovered from his camera's memory card, show what appears to be a ramshackle dwelling constructed from weathered wood, moss-covered and ancient, situated in a clearing that seems too perfectly circular to be natural. The images are distorted, as if the camera struggled to focus properly, but the basic shape is unmistakable. A hut elevated off the ground on what the hikers insisted looked like enormous, petrified bird legs. Anna's journal entry from that day is fragmented, excited, almost incoherent. She wrote the same phrase repeatedly. "We found it. We actually found it. We found it." But excitement quickly curdled into something darker. The old woman was there, standing in the doorway of the structure, and she invited them inside. Only Anna entered. Her description of the interior is bizarre and contradictory. She writes about a space that seemed larger than the exterior structure could possibly contain, about herbs hanging from rafters, about bones arranged in patterns she recognized from her folklore studies, about the overwhelming smell of earth and decay, and something else, something she could not name. The old woman offered her something to drink from a wooden cup. Anna, showing perhaps the only moment of caution in this entire doomed expedition, declined. She said the woman's expression changed then, the hospitality draining away to reveal something ancient and offended. The final coherent entries span April 24th through April 26th. The three hikers had retreated from the hut, but found themselves unable to navigate back to familiar territory. Dimitri's navigational equipment had failed completely. They were lost, confused, and the forest itself seemed hostile now. All three journals mention seeing riders in the distance. Mikhail described them most completely. 3 figures on horseback, one clothed entirely in white, one in brilliant red, and one in black as midnight. They appeared at dawn, at noon, at dusk, always at the edges of vision, always watching but never approaching. The hikers recognized the symbolism from their folklore research. In the tales of Baba Yaga, the white rider represents day, the red rider the sun, and the black rider the night. They were servants of the witch, extensions of her power, and their appearance in the stories always preceded significant supernatural events. Paranoia saturated every word they wrote. Anna became convinced they were being followed, that the trees themselves were rearranging when they were not looking. Dimitri heard voices calling his name from empty forests. Mikhail wrote about dreams so vivid, he could not distinguish them from waking reality. Dreams of the old woman standing over him, whispering in that archaic dialect, her breath cold as winter frost. They tried to mark their path with cairns and blazes on trees, but Dimitri's journal notes finding their own markers in places they swore they had never been, as if the forest was folding in on itself, trapping them in recursive loops of territory that should not exist. The last dated entry is from April 27th, written by Anna. Her handwriting had deteriorated, the letters jagged and uneven. She described waking to find the old woman standing at the edge of their camp, perfectly still, watching them with those dark, impossible eyes. Dimitri and Mikhail were still sleeping, and Anna felt paralyzed, unable to move or call out. The woman smiled, and Anna wrote that she finally understood what they had found was not some artifact of ancient belief, but something that had always been real, something that predated the stories, that the stories themselves were warnings disguised as entertainment. The entry ends mid-sentence. She is showing me what happens to those who seek without under. The final messages were not written in the journals, but carved into trees surrounding their abandoned campsite. Search parties found them 3 weeks later after the hikers failed to return. The words were crude, hacked into bark with what might have been a knife, or perhaps fingernails. They ride at dawn. She is coming. The forest has teeth. Should not have looked. She is in the walls. We cannot leave. We cannot leave. We cannot leave. We cannot leave. The repetition suggested psychological breakdown, but the searchers found something that troubled them more than the messages themselves. The carvings covered dozens of trees in a wide radius, far more than 3 people could have conceivably created in the time frame of their disappearance. Some of the carvings were high up, 15 or 20 feet above the ground, in positions that would have required climbing equipment the hikers did not possess. The photographs recovered from multiple cameras told a fragmentary and disturbing story. Images of the hut, the old woman, the clearing with its too perfect circle. But there were other photographs, ones the hikers apparently took without realizing it, images captured by cameras left running or triggered accidentally. These showed figures in the background, shadowy forms that might have been other people or might have been tricks of light through dense foliage. Enhancement of these images by investigators proved inconclusive. The final photograph on Mikhail's camera has become the source of endless speculation and debate. It shows a tree line at what appears to be dusk or dawn, the quality grainy and poorly exposed. Standing among the trees is a figure, elderly and bent, wearing what might be layers of dark clothing. The face is turned toward the camera, and though the resolution is poor, those who have studied the image report a profound sense of unease, a feeling that the figure is not merely present in the photograph, but somehow aware of being photographed, that those dark pixels representing eyes are looking not just at the camera, but through it, at anyone who views the image. Search parties scoured the area for weeks. The police investigation treated the disappearance as a case of hikers becoming lost and succumbing to exposure, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in the vast wilderness of the Urals. But searchers could never locate the structure shown in the photographs. They found the clearing, or what they believed was the clearing based on geographical features visible in the images, but there was no hut, no evidence that any structure had ever stood there. The perfectly circular formation of the trees remained, and some searchers reported feeling watched, feeling an inexplicable urge to leave the area as quickly as possible. Local guides who were hired to assist in the search refused to continue after several days. They would not explain their reasons in detail, but they spoke quietly among themselves in dialects the investigators did not fully understand, words about old things that should not be disturbed, about parts of the forest that belonged to powers that predated human settlement of the region. The official search was eventually called off. The families of the missing students hired private investigators, offered rewards, pleaded for continued efforts, but the trail had gone completely cold. 4 years later, in June of 2007, a group of geologists working in a region approximately 30 miles from the last known location of the hikers found human remains. DNA analysis confirmed the body was Mikhail Sokolov. The discovery should have provided closure, but instead it deepened the mystery. The location where he was found was across terrain so rugged that covering that distance on foot would have required weeks of difficult travel. More disturbing were the findings of the autopsy. The medical examiner's report noted several anomalies that remained unexplained. Mikhail's body showed signs of extreme emaciation, more severe than could be accounted for by the presumed timeline of his death. His hands and feet bore what appeared to be frostbite damage, but the tissue degradation patterns did not match any known pathology of cold exposure. Most puzzling were marks on his bones, indentations, and scoring that the examiner initially thought might be animal predation, but the patterns were inconsistent with any known species in the region. The final autopsy report included an unusual addendum, a note from the examining physician stating that certain findings defied conventional medical explanation and recommending further forensic analysis that was never conducted due to lack of funding and official interest. Dmitry Volkov and Anna Chernysheva remain missing. Their families have never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, but as years have turned to decades, hope has transformed into something else, a kind of haunted acceptance that some questions cannot be answered through conventional means. The case file remains technically open, but no active investigation continues. The forest section where the hikers disappeared has become a place of local legend. Guides refuse to take expeditions there, and the few hikers who venture into that territory without local assistance often report unusual experiences: malfunctioning equipment, feelings of disorientation, the sensation of being observed by unseen watchers. The photographs remain, locked in evidence storage or circulated endlessly online, examined by amateur detectives and paranormal enthusiasts who see in those grainy images confirmation of their various beliefs. The image of the figure at the tree line has been analyzed by photo experts, declared both genuine and fabricated depending on who conducts the analysis. But those who knew the three students insist that whatever else might be true, Dmitry, Anna, and Mikhail believed completely in what they were seeking. Their final journal entries speak not of hoax or delusion, but of absolute conviction that they had crossed some threshold between the world of rational explanation and something far older, far stranger, far more dangerous than academic folklore studies could ever encompass. The white, red, and black riders still appear in the nightmares of those who have studied this case too deeply, spectral figures at the boundaries of consciousness, servants of something that dwells in the deep forest, something that was old when the first stories were told, something that does not appreciate being sought by those who lack proper respect or understanding. The hut on chicken legs remains unfound, but those who have looked at the evidence, who have read the desperate final words carved into those trees, cannot help but wonder if perhaps it was never meant to be found, only to find those foolish enough to go looking. We set out to find Baba Yaga, to untangle the threads of legend from reality, to understand why this skeletal witch in her impossible house has haunted the forests and imaginations of Eastern Europe for countless generations. But perhaps the real question was never whether Baba Yaga exists. Perhaps the question was always what she represents. In every culture, across every inhabited continent, there are guardians at the threshold, figures who stand between the known world and the wild darkness beyond. The Greeks had Hecate, goddess of crossroads and magic, keeper of keys to hidden realms. The Norse spoke of Volvas, wise women who read fate and spoke with the dead from their remote places of power. The Japanese tell of Yama-uba, mountain witches who possess terrible knowledge and grant it only at a price. But Baba Yaga, she endures in a way few others do. She persists not just in stories told to children, but in whispered accounts that continue to this day, in sightings reported by rational people who insist they saw something impossible among the birch trees. The question that haunts us now, as our investigation draws to a close, is this. What does it mean that Baba Yaga refuses to fade? In an age of satellites and searchable forests, of thermal imaging and GPS coordinates, why do the stories continue? Why do elderly women still leave offerings at certain trees deep in the Carpathian wilderness? Why do experienced hunters avoid particular clearings? And why do foresters mark certain areas on their maps with symbols that have no official meaning? Some would call it superstition, the last stubborn remnants of peasant thinking clinging to life in remote corners of the modern world. But superstition is a convenient word we use to dismiss what we do not understand, to create comfortable distance between ourselves and the possibility that the boundaries of reality might be more porous than we dare admit. Carl Jung wrote of archetypes, patterns embedded so deeply in human consciousness that they emerge independently across cultures and epochs. The wise crone who devours the unworthy and transforms the worthy. The guardian who tests those who seek forbidden knowledge. The ambiguous figure who is neither good nor evil, but something older, something that operates by rules we can barely comprehend. Baba Yaga fits this pattern perfectly. She is the archetype made flesh, or perhaps made legend, the living embodiment of a truth every human culture eventually discovers, that wisdom and danger are inseparable, that transformation requires descent, that real knowledge always comes at a price. In the forests of Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and beyond, there are women who live as Baba Yaga once did. Herbalists who know which mushrooms heal and which invite visions. Midwives who understand the threshold between life and death more intimately than any physician. Keepers of old songs, old remedies, old ways that predate Christianity, that predate written history itself. When we visited these women during our investigation, we found something unexpected. Not the theatrical witch of folklore, but something perhaps more unsettling. Ordinary women who carry extraordinary knowledge, who speak of the forest as a living intelligence, who claim the old powers never left. They simply learned to hide. One such woman, living in a village of fewer than 20 souls deep in the Bialowesia forest, told us that Baba Yaga is not one witch but many, a title passed down, a role assumed by those who cross certain thresholds. She spoke of liminality, of spaces between, of how the forest creates its own logic for those who venture deep enough and stay long enough. She would not give us her name, but she told us this: the chicken-legged hut is not a literal structure, but a state of being, a place that exists outside normal space, accessible only to those who know how to see it. And those who find it, she said, are never quite the same afterward, if they return at all. This brings us to the disappearances. Over the decades we researched, we found accounts of more than 30 individuals who went into the deep forests of Eastern Europe, searching for Baba Yaga, and never emerged. Folklorists, thrill seekers, practitioners of various occult traditions, documentary filmmakers. Some of these cases have prosaic explanations. The forest is vast and indifferent, and people get lost, succumb to exposure, fall into bogs or ravines. But others resist such easy answers. Search parties that found no trace. Abandoned camps with meals half-eaten and equipment left behind. And in 3 separate cases, witnesses who claimed they saw the missing person walking deeper into the forest, following something the witnesses themselves could not see, refusing to respond to calls, moving with strange purpose toward an unknown destination. The investigator becomes the investigated. The hunter becomes the hunted. This is the pattern Baba Yaga teaches, the truth embedded in her tales. Those who seek her with arrogance, who approach the boundary with entitlement, who demand rather than ask, these the stories say she grinds to dust with her iron teeth, uses their bones to fortify the fence around her impossible house. But those who come with respect, with genuine need, with willingness to pay the price wisdom demands, these she might help, might teach, might send back transformed. And so we are left with questions that have no comfortable answers. Are the persistence of Baba Yaga sightings and beliefs merely cultural memory, stories too deeply rooted to fade even when the world that created them has transformed beyond recognition? Or is there something more, something that suggests Baba Yaga, whatever she truly is, remains present because she serves a function no amount of modernity can replace? Every civilization needs its boundaries. Every society requires guardians who embody what lies beyond the safe, the known, the controlled. In eliminating the wild places, have we created a hunger for what they represented? In explaining everything, have we lost something essential about the nature of mystery itself? The elderly women living in remote cottages throughout Eastern Europe, brewing their bitter teas and speaking to the forest in languages half forgotten, are they simply living remnants of an older time? Or are they maintaining something deliberately, keeping alive a thread of connection to powers that most of us have chosen to forget? When they leave offerings at ancient trees, when they observe taboos about which paths to walk and which to avoid, when they warn visitors about certain nights and certain places, are they trapped in obsolete thinking or preserving knowledge we may yet need? We may never answer these questions with certainty, but perhaps that is precisely the point. Baba Yaga exists in the realm of uncertainty, in the spaces our neat categories cannot contain. She is the reminder that not everything can be known, explained, controlled. She is the terror of genuine wildness and the promise of genuine transformation, forever inseparable. Those who went searching for her and never returned, what did they find? Did the forest simply claim them, as forests have claimed countless wanderers throughout human history? Or did they cross a threshold they did not fully understand, step from seeker into prey, discover too late that the price of certain knowledge is the self that sought it? There is a fine line between the two roles, finer than most realize. The seeker and the prey are separated not by strength or preparation, but by something more subtle: respect for the boundary itself, understanding that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, awareness that transformation and destruction are sometimes indistinguishable until the process is complete. As we conclude this investigation, as we step back from the edge of the deep forest and return to our illuminated, explicable world, one image remains: the silhouette of a hut on impossible legs, standing against a darkening sky, the creak of fence posts made from bones, the sound, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the trees, of something ancient, grinding, preparing, waiting, patient as only immortal things can be patient. Baba Yaga endures because the boundary endures. The threshold between civilization and wilderness, knowledge and annihilation, seeker and prey. And as long as humans dare to cross it, as long as we hunger for what lies beyond the safe limits of our understood world, she will be there. Neither monster nor benefactor. Neither enemy nor ally. Simply the guardian, asking the only question that matters: what price are you willing to pay for what you seek to know? The forest keeps its secrets. Some who enter never leave. And somewhere, in a clearing that exists on no map, a hut turns slowly on its chicken legs, and the old witch smiles with her iron teeth and waits. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.